Every great shift in history has been sparked by a single mind daring to think differently. Not stronger, not louder, just clearer. Yet these minds, instead of being celebrated, are often shunned, ridiculed, or even silenced. Why? Because intelligence threatens the comfortable illusions that keep the world predictable. A truly independent thinker doesn't just see what is, they see what could be. And in a world built on repetition, the future is the most frightening force of all. Tonight, we dive deep into this fear, where it comes from, who it targets, and why it just might be the most telling sign of untapped power. There is something unsettling about a person who thinks too deeply, too often. Society doesn't fear the loudest man in the room. It fears the quiet one, the one who watches, calculates, and questions everything. Why? Because thinking, real thinking, is dangerous. A man with an independent mind cannot be easily swayed. He cannot be sold lies, tricked by illusion, or bribed with comfort. He is not a follower. And when someone refuses to follow blindly, the herd gets nervous. You see, when a man begins to think for himself, he steps out of line, and society needs lines. It needs order. It needs predictability. But the independent thinker, he throws all of that into chaos. You might believe that intelligence is celebrated, but the truth, it's tolerated as long as it doesn't shake the foundations. Ask yourself, why is it that the most revolutionary minds are often ignored in their time, laughed at, ridiculed, even punished? Because original thought is rarely convenient. It doesn't comfort the masses, it confronts them. It asks uncomfortable questions. It shines a light where people would rather keep things dark. The thinker doesn't just accept the rules, he asks why the rules exist. He doesn't just follow the system, he studies it, dissects it, and sometimes dares to challenge it. And that makes him a threat. And imagine a room where everyone is clapping in rhythm, heads nodding in agreement, voices echoing the same tune. Now picture someone standing in silence, arms crossed, eyes skeptical, heart unmoved. That one person is the most dangerous person in the room, not because he's violent, not because he's loud, but because he sees, and seeing clearly in a world that thrives on distortion. That's revolutionary. True intelligence doesn't scream, it whispers, and those whispers can unravel centuries of conditioning. Those whispers, if heard by too many, could change everything. That's why thinkers are feared, not because they're wrong, but because they might be right. History doesn't punish stupidity, it punishes audacity. The audacity to think, the audacity to know, and worse, the audacity to teach others to think. That is the real crime in the eyes of the crowd. But what happens when intelligence is exiled long enough? What happens when those with vision are told to sit down, shut up, and stay small? Well, eventually those minds stop sharing what they see. Or worse, they go silent entirely. But there's something more dangerous than an intelligent person who speaks. It's an intelligent person who's been watching, and in the next chapter, we look at what happens when that watchful mind refuses to play along, when it begins to rise quietly, powerfully, and alone. Are you ready for that? Because that's when the real fear begins. What makes a man dangerous isn't the power in his hands, it's the power in his mind. A sharp mind doesn't need an army, doesn't need applause, doesn't even need approval. It only needs clarity. Because once a person begins to see the world clearly, the world can never control him the same way again. Independent thought is rare, not because people are incapable of thinking, but because they're conditioned not to. From the moment we can speak, we're taught what to think, not how. We're told what's acceptable, what's safe, what's normal. But when someone breaks away from that mold, when someone dares to ask, is this really true? That's when the silent alarms go off. See, the masses are held together not by strength, but by sameness, common beliefs, shared fears, group opinions. It creates comfort, it creates unity, but it also creates blindness. And one independent mind, One person who sees through the fog becomes a threat to all of it. That's the hidden power, thought that isn't chained to tradition, not owned by public opinion, not bought by reward or praise. An independent mind doesn't wait for permission to think. It thinks freely, relentlessly, and with that comes a kind of freedom most people will never take. But here's the part that really shakes the world. Independent thinkers don't just wake up, they wake others up. And the moment someone breaks away from the herd, the others start to wonder, if he can live without the leash, why can't I? That's the crack in the wall. That's the beginning of change. And that's what society fears the most. You'll notice when someone thinks independently, they're often called difficult, rebellious, arrogant, dangerous. But think about this. Why would thinking for yourself be considered dangerous? Unless, of course, those in power need you to think like them. Masses are easy to steer when everyone's looking in the same direction. But one person, one thinker, looking elsewhere, that's enough to disrupt everything. That's why they distract you. That's why they keep your mind busy, your thoughts scattered, your focus divided. Because if you ever took a moment to really think, freely, deeply, independently, you might see the strings pulling it all. And once you see the strings, you can't unsee them. So what happens when enough people begin to think for themselves? When independent minds no longer seek acceptance, but impact? What happens when the desire to be right outweighs the desire to be liked? That's not just the rise of intelligence. That's the rise of influence. And in the next step of this journey, we'll discover what happens when society starts to sense that intelligence is no longer silent, when fear turns into resistance. Because the most feared minds are the ones that refuse to be quiet. Throughout history, it's never been the masses that led revolutions. It's always been the few, the enlightened few, those rare minds who saw the world not as it was presented, but as it truly was. And it is precisely those minds that society fears the most. Why? Because the enlightened are not fooled by surface-level truths. They are not seduced by approval. They are not dependent on validation. They carry something deeper, a vision, a knowing. And when a person knows, really knows, they become immune to manipulation. You can't guilt them. You can't shame them. You can't bribe them with comfort or scare them with exile. They have already paid the price of truth. The enlightened few are dangerous because they walk a path that others cannot see. They challenge not only ideas, but identities. They ask questions that tear at the roots of belief. And when you threaten belief, you threaten control. Society isn't built to handle too many enlightened minds. It's built to contain them. They are often painted as radicals, outcasts, eccentrics, not because they are, but because labeling them is easier than listening to them. The truth they carry doesn't come wrapped in politeness. It doesn't fit into sound bites or slogans. It burns, it disrupts, it demands change. You can walk into any system, any institution, any culture, and you'll find the same pattern. Silence the few who see too much. Ridicule the few who say too much. Distract the many and keep them comfortable enough not to ask. Because once the light of truth spreads, there's no going back. But here's the twist. The enlightened don't fear being outnumbered. They expect it. They don't crave the spotlight. They don't demand followers. They simply act quietly, consistently, powerfully. And that is terrifying, because one awakened mind carries more force than 1,000 compliant ones. It's not noise that changes the world. It's clarity. And clarity, when possessed by the few, can unravel the illusion that keeps the many asleep. So what does society do? It distracts, it entertains, it pacifies, it creates 1,000 shallow truths to keep people from discovering the one deep truth, the one that lives in the minds of the few who refuse to trade awareness for acceptance. But here's the question. What happens when these few stop hiding? When they stop whispering and begin building? Because the moment the enlightened stop watching from the shadows and start creating their own systems, their own paths, their own movements, the ground begins to shift. And in the next chapter we face the part most people pretend doesn't exist. What society is willing to do to silence a mind it cannot control. There is a war being waged, but you won't hear it on the news. No explosions, no armies, no flags. It's silent, subtle, hidden in plain sight. And its targets are not the wealthy, not the powerful, but the intelligent, the mental giants, the ones who dare to use their minds beyond the limits imposed on them. Society doesn't always attack with force, it attacks with silence. It doesn't always destroy, it dismisses. And when a mind becomes too sharp, too clear, too free, it becomes inconvenient. So what does society do? It isolates it, labels it, mocks it, and slowly pushes it to the edge where its power can't spread. Mental giants aren't feared because they're dangerous in the usual way. They don't use fists, they use questions. They don't need weapons, they have ideas. And that's the problem. Ideas once released can't be undone. You can burn books, silence voices, erase names, but you can't kill a thought that's already been planted in someone's mind. So, the war begins before the mind even knows it's a target. From an early age, brilliance is shaped, boxed, molded to fit in. The child who questions too much, labeled difficult. The teen who thinks differently, called rebellious. The adult who challenges norms, branded danger. It's not correction, it's containment. You see, society has a blueprint, a comfortable script. It wants you to follow. Wake up, obey, conform, repeat. But the mental giant, he writes his own script. And that is a problem. He's not waiting for permission. He's not seeking applause. He's not afraid of standing alone. In fact, he prefers it, because in solitude there's truth. In solitude there's clarity. And clarity is the last thing a society built on illusion wants you to have. So what happens next? The war gets colder, more psychological. Opportunities are denied. Platforms are stripped. Influence is blocked. Not through open battle, but through quiet resistance, through invisible barriers, all while smiling faces pretend everything's fine. But here's the secret. Mental giants don't break under pressure. They build under pressure, and every push against them becomes fuel. Every door slammed becomes a reason to create a new one. Every rejection becomes redirection. And slowly, very slowly, the world begins to feel their presence again. Because brilliance can't be buried forever. And as that brilliance begins to return, something else starts to happen. The rules begin to bend. The systems begin to shift. The crowd starts to notice. And that is when fear turns into opposition. Because the only thing more terrifying than a mind that can't be controlled is a mind that refuses to stay silent. Now ask yourself, what happens when that mind doesn't just speak but lead? We're not just talking about rejection anymore. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when a visionary is no longer ignored, but targeted. What happens when a person sees further than others can imagine, when they speak of things that haven't happened yet, when their eyes are locked on a future that feels impossible to everyone else. They're called a visionary. But being a visionary isn't a gift that comes wrapped in applause. It's a burden, a heavy one, because society doesn't reward those who think ahead. It restrains them. It doesn't ask, "What do you see?" It asks, "Why can't you just be normal?" The visionary walks into a room full of people obsessed with now, and talks about next. He warns of dangers no one else sees. He offers ideas no one's ready to understand, and that makes him dangerous. Not because he's wrong, but because he's early. And when you're early, you're misunderstood. So society wraps the visionary in chains, not made of steel, but of doubt, of shame, of rules. It tells him to wait his turn, tone it down, be more like everyone else, fit in, follow, don't question, don't push, don't challenge the way things are. Because if he's right, if he's really right, then everyone else is going to have to change. And that is what they fear. So the visionary is made to feel small. He's criticized not for his flaws, but for his he's warned not about failure, but about success. Because if he succeeds on his own terms, others will realize they never needed permission to rise either. And the moment people realize that, control starts to crack. But here's the truth no one wants to admit. Visionaries aren't created by comfort, they're forged in resistance. They've been mocked, dismissed, shut out, and yet they keep going. Why? Because they can't help it. The vision burns too brightly. The future whispers too loudly. They've seen something they can't unsee. And once a mind has tasted what's possible, no chain can hold it forever. You can delay a visionary. You can block him. You can throw stones in his path. But the very act of resisting him becomes his training. The harder you push, the sharper he becomes. Until one day he stops asking for space and takes it. And then everything begins to shift. The crowd that once laughed starts to listen. The doors that once closed begin to crack open. Because even society eventually recognizes the pattern. Those who see further often shape the path for those who doubted them. But here's the part no one talks about. Not every visionary is allowed to rise. Some are stopped, silenced, crushed before their time. Because when a visionary refuses to break, society changes its strategy. And in the next chapter, we'll look into the subtle, powerful ways the system removes those it cannot control, without leaving a trace. Not every war is loud. Sometimes the most powerful attacks don't come with guns or chains. They come with distractions, delays, and quiet doors that never open. The system doesn't always destroy a visionary. It derails them, and it does it so smoothly, so silently, that most never even realize it's happening. See, when a person rises too fast, thinks too clearly, or questions too deeply, the system doesn't always strike with force. No, first, it offers comfort, a promotion, a title, a paycheck, something to keep that mind just busy enough, just tired enough, just satisfied enough to stop asking dangerous questions. It whispers, "You're doing well, why risk more?" And many listen, because the sabotage doesn't look like sabotage. It looks like success. It feels like acceptance. It's the meeting that leads nowhere. The opportunity that sounds perfect but never comes. The partnership that drains time but delivers nothing. One distraction after another. One delay after another. Until the fire begins to dim. And when that doesn't work, the system gets smart. It starts to isolate, slowly, quietly. It places the thinker in rooms where no one understands them, surrounds them with people who speak but don't see. It drains them with noise, drowns their clarity in chaos. It doesn't need to silence the visionary, it just needs to exhaust them. Because once a sharp mind is tired enough, once it's overwhelmed enough, it begins to doubt itself. And that's the goal. Not to destroy the thinker, but to make the thinker hesitate, because hesitation is the slowest form of death. It's not always the loud lies that stop a person, it's the whispered doubts. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe the world isn't ready. Maybe this idea is just impossible. And one by one, those thoughts chip away at the fire. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, strategically, until one day, the visionary stops building, not because they were defeated, but because they were drained. That's how the system works, not through destruction, but redirection. You think you're still on your path, but you're walking in circles. You think you're still free, but the cage is just comfortable. But every once in a while, someone notices. Someone sees the pattern, feels the weight, realizes they've been held back, not by failure, but by design. And when that realization hits, something changes. They don't just escape the sabotage, they rebel against it. And that is when things get dangerous. Because a mind that's been manipulated and then wakes up doesn't come back the same. And in the next chapter, we explore what happens when these minds no longer try to fit in, but begin to stand together. What happens when the mind becomes too powerful, too precise, too different from the rest? It gets isolated, not because it's wrong, not because it's broken, but because it can't be controlled. See, society doesn't know what to do with a person who doesn't follow the script. It doesn't know how to embrace someone who questions everything. So instead of celebrating that mind, it pushes it to the edge, quietly, consistently, ruthlessly. You start to notice it when the room goes quiet after you speak, when the energy shifts, when you share your truth, when your ideas, your vision, your clarity are met with blank stares or subtle smiles that hide discomfort. And the message is clear: you're too much for us. So, what does the great mind do? Look around, and you'll see a pattern. Those who obey get rewarded, those who conform get celebrated, those who follow the rules stay quiet, play it safe. They climb faster, they're embraced, they're praised as team players. But the genius, the one who thinks differently, the one who challenges the very system that hands out those rewards, that person becomes a threat. You see, society doesn't reward truth, it rewards comfort. It doesn't elevate the sharpest minds, it elevates the most agreeable ones, the people who make others feel safe, not the ones who reveal how unsafe their beliefs might actually be. So genius is often hidden, overlooked, even punished, not because it lacks value, but because it shines too brightly. And when a light gets too bright, it starts to expose everything around it: the flaws, the lies, the fragile egos built on untested assumptions. And nobody in power wants that kind of exposure. So instead of encouraging brilliance, the system trains obedience. From a young age, people are told what to think, how to think, when to think, not how to create, not how to question, just how to follow. Get good grades, follow the formula, fit in. And those who do, they're rewarded with titles, promotions, praise, not because they're the most original, but because they're the most predictable. But the genius, the one who sees through it all, they don't want to be managed. They don't want to be controlled. They want to create. And so the system begins to push back. It says, you're difficult. You're intense. You're not a good fit. Not because their work isn't excellent, but because their mind is a mirror. And people don't like what they see when someone shows them how small they've been thinking. So genius becomes the outsider, the one with the ideas too bold, the questions too sharp, the clarity too threatening. And still, they keep going. Because while society rewards compliance today, history remembers genius tomorrow. But before that genius is remembered, it's rejected, it's tested, pushed, mocked, silent. Because the world doesn't change by accepting genius, it changes by resisting it, and then being forced to admit it was right. But here's the twist: some geniuses stop waiting for permission, they stop looking for approval. They build anyway. And when that happens, when brilliance stops asking and starts creating, the crowd begins to stir. And in the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when suppressed brilliance finds a platform of its own. What scares society more than anything? It's not wealth, it's not power, it's not even rebellion. It's influence that can't be controlled. Because influence is invisible. You can't cage it, you can't silence it with a title, and you definitely can't regulate it when it comes from someone who thinks freely, speaks boldly, and refuses to follow the script. And that's where intelligent people become dangerous. Not because they're violent, not because they break the rules, but because they show others that it's possible to think beyond them. One idea from one person can shake an entire structure. It's not the person, it's their ability to wake others up, their power to shift perception, to break mental patterns, to expose the fake stability that society pretends is real. Because once a mind is expanded, it never goes back to its original size. So, what does society do? It begins to monitor that influence closely, carefully. It starts to measure how far that voice is spreading, who's listening, who's changing. And when the numbers grow, when the words begin to ripple through the crowd. That's when the system presses down, not with open force, but with subtle suppression. It starts with discrediting. They're extreme, then isolating. They're controversial, then removing. They're no longer relevant. Because if too many people begin to think for themselves, the whole system starts to tremble. And here's what they fear most: it's not the content, it's the clarity. The way these minds can slice through noise, the way they make truth sound undeniable, the way they say what everyone's been afraid to say. But once it's said, no one can unhear it. You see, society depends on noise, on confusion, on distraction, but a sharp mind cuts through it like a blade. And that's terrifying, because influence spreads faster than control. Ideas can't be contained once they've been felt. And a free thinker with a voice, that's a revolution waiting to happen. They don't need approval. They don't need permission. They only need a platform. And once that platform is built, not handed to them, not given out of pity, but built with their own hands, something shifts. People start to gather. They listen. They resonate. They repeat. And that's when fear becomes panic, because the influence can no longer be stopped. But what happens when these voices don't just influence thoughts, but begin to move people into action? What happens when ideas start turning into movement? That's what we'll uncover next. When we reveal how true intelligence doesn't just inspire, it unites. There comes a moment when intelligence steps out of isolation and becomes something more. It stops whispering in corners, stops hiding behind books, stops waiting for a seat at someone else's table. It rises. It begins to speak, not just to analyze, but to lead. And when that happens, everything changes. Because leadership born from raw intelligence isn't based on rank, or title, or permission. It's based on truth. It's not loud, but it's undeniable. It doesn't chase followers. It attracts them. Why? Because deep down, people recognize clarity. They crave it. They want to follow someone who doesn't just echo noise, but cuts through it. And that's when fear creeps in, not into the intelligent person, but into the system watching them. Because now the thinker has become a mover. They're not just observing from the sidelines anymore. They're taking action. People are listening. People are responding. And suddenly the intelligent voice is no longer just a thought. It's a direction, a path, a force. Leadership like this can't be manufactured. It can't be bought. And it definitely can't be controlled. That's why it scares society. Because every structure built on obedience begins to tremble when one free thinker turns into a leader of other free thinkers. The old rules don't apply anymore. The rewards and punishments lose their grip. The silence begins to break. And suddenly, the crowd starts moving. Not because they were forced, but because they were inspired. That's the real danger to a system designed to suppress power. Because now it's not one mind, it's many, connected, aligned, awake. This isn't about chaos. It's not about rebellion for the sake of noise. It's directional. It's intentional. And that's what makes it unstoppable. Because when intelligence becomes leadership, it spreads. It teaches others how to see, how to think, how to question without fear, how to move without asking, how to build without waiting. That's when the system begins to panic. Because leadership born from intelligence doesn't stop at influence. It begins to transform everything it touches. And those in power, they feel it. They watch the shift. They see the momentum, and they realize it's no longer about controlling one mind. It's about stopping a movement they didn't authorize and now can't contain. But it doesn't end here. Because what happens next is the part society tries hardest to prevent. It's not just when the leader speaks, it's when others begin to lead too. And in the next chapter, we'll uncover what happens when intelligent people don't just rise alone, but create an entire generation of thinkers. One awakened mind is powerful, but a mind that awakens others, that's unstoppable. That's the point where fear in the system turns into panic. Because now it's not about silencing one voice, it's about containing a ripple effect that's already begun to spread. When intelligent people start to speak truth in a way that others can feel, understand, and act upon, something radical happens. People stop following blindly. They begin to question. They begin to see. They begin to realize that maybe, just maybe, the limits they've lived under weren't real, that the rules were just suggestions, that the ceilings were placed there, not by nature but by design. And that realization, it's electric, because the moment a person realizes they were caged by illusion, they start tearing down walls, not just for themselves, but for others. That's when the intelligent leader becomes more than a voice. They become a mirror. They reflect to others what's possible. They show them their own buried power, not by giving them answers, but by reminding them to ask better questions. Questions like, why am I doing this? Who told me I couldn't? What would happen if I stopped asking for permission? And when those questions start to spread, society reaches a breaking point. The system thrives on routine, on repetition, on silence. But the moment people start thinking, truly thinking, everything becomes unstable. And not in a reckless way, but in a revolutionary way. Because awakened people don't need to be pushed anymore. They pull themselves forward. They take ownership. They light fires in places the system thought were safely dark. And the more minds that awaken, the faster it spreads. See, intelligence isn't contagious, but courage is. When people see someone speak truth and survive, they want to speak too. When they watch someone walk away from fake success and build their own path, they start to question their own. And when they realize they're not alone in their doubts, their visions, their fire, they become something society can no longer ignore. A network of awakened minds, not led by force, not driven by fear, but fueled by purpose. That's when the world changes, not by one loud moment, but by a million quiet awakenings happening all at once. But the question now becomes, what happens when these awakened minds start to see patterns, patterns of control, of manipulation, of fear, and begin to tear them down systematically? That's what we'll dive into next. When intelligence meets awareness, and the illusion begins to crumble, the moment true awareness breaks free from the chains of ignorance, the system starts to crumble. And it doesn't crumble with a loud crash. It doesn't fall apart in a dramatic, fiery explosion. No, it breaks down quietly, subtly, like a glass that's been cracked and slowly splintering, piece by piece, until the whole structure shatters. When people begin to see beyond the illusion, when they begin to recognize how deep the manipulation goes, how long they've been kept in the dark, something inside them shifts. They don't just wake up to their own potential. They wake up to the system's flaws, to its lies, to the things that have been carefully hidden for so long, to keep them in line. Once this awareness takes root, the walls that have kept society in place begin to feel thinner. They start to shake. Because here's the thing about awareness, it doesn't just stop